If you've been following the recent controversy surrounding the Venice Biennale, don't look at the pavilions, look at the leisure. Right now, as you watch this, the market prices of the artworks presented there are preparing to skyrocket. And why is it so? Because their provenance is actively being manufactured in real time. We are taught to look at art through the lens of aesthetic appreciation. We talk about the form, color, emotion, and genius, but the reality of the art world is far more calculated. Art is not merely a site of beauty, it is a site of raw contestation, and the ultimate arbiter of an artwork's value, power, and legitimacy is its provenance. Provenance is often sanitized as an artwork's biography, a dusty, neutral, archival record of who, what, and when, but it is actually way more complicated than that. Provenance is the mechanism that transforms paint and canvas into sovereign financial capital, historical leverage, and symbolic dominance. To understand how the art world truly functions, we must dismantle its Enlightenment facade. By examining the hidden architecture of provenance, we can uncover four uncomfortable truths. First, the extraction of value. How both historical and contemporary art carry deep internalized narratives of coercion, exploitation, and contested legitimacy. Second, the shadow economy. How art operates as a highly unregulated, hyper-portable quasi-currency designed to launder wealth and obscure global transactions. Third, the magnetism of power. Why the ruling elite are structurally attracted to art and why the market is inherently susceptible to criminal exploitation. Fourth, the ontological escape. How art's persistent resistance to fixed categorization fundamentally destabilizes the Western legal frameworks built on private property. Welcome to the world of provenance research, where the art world is stripped of its pretension and exposed as a brilliant, volatile battlefield of power. For centuries, the history of museums has been packaged as a noble narrative of preservation and public enlightenment. But since the 1960s, this facade has been systemically dismantled. Artists pioneering the movement of institutional critique began exposing the hidden economies, systemic exclusions, and power structures that underpin our cultural temples. They revealed that the museum is not a neutral vessel for culture, but an active agent in the manufacturing of value. Provenance research is the logical modern extension of this critical project. It shifts our focus away from the grand architecture of the museum or decoration of the gallery and directs it squarely at the foundations of the collections themselves, the objects. As artist and theorist Andrea Fraser observed in her essay From the Critique of Institutions to an Institution of Critique, we cannot simply view institutions as external structures we can step outside of. As she put it, just as art cannot exist outside the field of art, we cannot exist outside the field of art, at least not as artists, critics, curators, and etc. It is because the institution is inside of us and we cannot get outside of ourselves. So, if there's no outside of the institution, then every piece of cultural production is irrevocably embedded within systems of power and meaning. The biography of an artwork cannot be a neutral ledger. Instead, it acts as a mirror reflecting the societal power dynamics that allow the object to circulate in the first place. Provenance research is a form of critical inquiry that exposes exactly how these beautiful objects are entangled in systems of domination, exclusion, and economic manipulation. At its core, provenance asks a deceptively simple question: who possessed this artwork, under what conditions, and how did it change hands? But this archival investigation quickly becomes ethically explosive. Provenance routinely uncovers conditions of ownership constructed through raw violence, asymmetrical power, or wartime coercion. In Provenance, an alternate history of art, scholar Janine Tang notes that the biography of an artwork often reads as an alternate history of the world itself. In pre-war art, these records hold dark stories of unlawful or violent acquisition. In contemporary art, they map out speculative strategies for future market making. This creates a bizarre structural discrepancy in the art market. While the unethical acquisition of an artwork may be thoroughly documented and publicly condemned, its market value frequently remains completely untouched, or even increases. Look at the history of older masterpieces. Housed in major European or North American museums, many are deeply implicated in colonial extraction and Nazi-era looting. A stark contemporary example occurred on November 19, 2025 at Sotheby's, when Gustav Klimt's masterpiece Blumenwiese, or in English Bloom and Meadow, achieved a staggering $86 million. Well, celebrated globally as a supreme cultural treasure, the painting's provenance is actively entangled in bitter long-running disputes over Nazi-era expropriation. As documented in landmark investigative reporting by New York Times, these disputes turn artworks into legal and moral lightning rods. Restitution in this context is not just about physical logistics, it is an act of historical justice attempting to repair the uncanny ruptures in an object's violent biography. We might assume that this ethical friction is a relic of the past, but contemporary art is entangled in forms of ownership that are just as problematic, if more diffuse. Modern artistic value possesses a terrifying resilience in the face of public backlash. For example, look at the careers of living mega artists like Damien Hirst or Jeff Koons. Severe sustained criticism, whether directed at Hirst's industrial use of animal carcasses or actual human skulls, or Koons' corporate assembly line modes of production and frequent copyright infringement lawsuits, has done nothing to slow their commercial dominance. In the hyper-capitalist art market, controversy is not a bug, it is a feature. It is easily absorbed into the artist's public profile, driving visibility and reinforcing their institutional stature. If you've seen the case of Dana Schultz's painting Open Casket from 2017 at the Whitney Biennial, her depiction of the mutilated body of Emmett Till provoked furious protests, and understandably so, with activists demanding the painting to be removed and destroyed, arguing that it constituted an unacceptable appropriation of black suffering. As sociologist Robin Autry noted, the debate extended far beyond the canvas to a battle over symbolic ownership. Who has the right to represent, circulate, and capitalize on cultural trauma? Yet, looking at Schultz's career today, the institutional art world has completely metabolized the shock. She continues to be represented by blue-chip powerhouses like David Swerner and enjoys major solo retrospectives across Europe. The controversy did not marginalize her, it became the definitive discursive framework that enhanced her position in the field. Banksy's self-destruction stunt, where a girl with balloons shredded itself into lava is in the bin, the moment the auction hammer fell, demonstrates how provenance can be actively engineered as live spectacle. The literal destruction of the asset became its new historical anchor, instantly driving its market desirability to record-breaking heights. In every era, provenance is an active site of negotiation where economic value, legal title, and cultural trauma are traded like currency. As art has become hyper-commodified, it has evolved from a cultural milestone into one of the premier instruments of global financial manipulation. In our globalized economy, the art market's total lack of regulation paired with the radically subjective nature of valuation makes it an ideal ecosystem for money laundering, tax evasion, and wealth transfers. A study from December 2025 titled Why Art is a Prime Target for Organized Crime highlighted the reality. The art market's opacity and discretion make it particularly attractive to organized crime. Unlike real estate or traditional financial stocks, high-value artworks possess unique structural advantages for invisible capital. The vast majority of high-ticket sales happen via private treaties, utilizing shell companies, anonymous bids, and non-disclosure agreements. And assets price is not fixed by mathematical yield, but manufactured through speculative demand, institutional consensus, and marketing. A painting bought for $50,000 can be reappraised for $5 million with the right institutional backing. A single canvas can store $100 million of wealth in a physical form small enough to fit into the back of an SUV. Art can be stored indefinitely in sovereign tax havens like the ultra-secure freeports of Geneva or Luxembourg. Here, masterpieces are traded between anonymous billionaire owners as pure financial assets without the artwork ever leaving its climate-controlled wooden crate. This financialization perfectly embodies the concept of the spectacle by Kitty Bohr. In The Society of the Spectacle, he wrote, "All of life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into representation. The spectacle is capital accumulated to the point that it becomes images." In the modern market, the artwork is completely divorced from a lived aesthetic experience. It has become a literal representation of accumulated capital. This explains the staggering disconnect between ethics and market behavior. A hedge fund manager or a cartel boss doesn't care if a painting has a bloody disputed provenance. In fact, its financial utility as an anonymous, untraceable store of value completely outweighs its ethical baggage. The price itself becomes the spectacle, reinforcing the asset's desirability through pure financial performance. So, why are those in power so relentlessly attracted to art in the first place? And to answer this question, we get a look at Pierre Bourdieu's framework of cultural capital. Bourdieu illustrated that aesthetic preference and art consumption are directly weaponized to reinforce social hierarchies. The cultural capital objectified in material objects and media, such as writings, paintings, monuments, instruments, is transmissible in its materiality. Cultural goods can be appropriated both materially, which presupposes economic capital, and symbolically, which presupposes cultural capital. Ownership of fine art confers a rare elite form of legitimacy. It allows oligarchs, corrupt corporations, and authoritarian regimes to artwash their reputations, positioning themselves within refined civilized networks of taste and education. But this validation requires institutions. Elite museums, international galleries, and major auction houses act as the supreme course of taste. They set the criteria of value, determining which works are canonized and which are discarded. And then this creates a powerful closed-loop feedback system. Power legitimizes the art, and the art legitimizes the power. Yet, despite being captured by these financial and political systems, art possesses an elusive paradoxical nature. It is constantly playing a game of catch me if you can with Western laws. The entire Western concept of provenance relies on a strict, linear ontology of private property. An object must be owned individually, transferred legally, and quantified financially. But this framework is a Eurocentric reduction. As anthropologists Sharon MacDonald and Tal Adler argue in artistic provenance research, many objects currently sitting in Western museums, particularly those plundered from colonial contexts, originate from cultures where individual permanent ownership does not exist. Look at the wampum belts of Native American tribes, which are viewed as active social agents and living treaties rather than some property or just an object. Or for example, the Benin bronzes, brutally looted by British forces in the 19th century. To the Kingdom of Benin, those were not sculptures or artifacts. They were vital spiritual and cosmic extensions of royal memory and ancestral authority. When a Western museum uses archival provenance to track the legal chain of custody of a looted tribal object, it is aggressively imposing a property-based colonial framework onto an item that was never meant to become modified. It attempts to resolve a historical crime using the exact same legal logic that enabled the crime in the first place. As Abadrive observed in the social life of things, objects circulate through different regimes of value. What the West labels as commodity in analyticism, it is an inalienable sacred fragment of a community's soul. This echoes the Maori people concept of exchange, recorded by sociologist Marcel Mauss in The Gift. To make a gift of something to someone is to make a present of some part of oneself. The thing itself possesses a soul, is of the soul. Claims for the return of looted artifacts are not mere property disputes. They are radical demands for Western institutions to acknowledge entirely different systems of value. They challenge museums to abandon the language of ownership altogether and move towards the model of collaborative care and relational accountability. This resistance to ownership is not just found in ancient or non-Western objects. It is also alive in contemporary Western conceptual art. When Roland Barthes proclaimed the death of the author, he anticipated a world where art would resist being tied down to a single creator or static object. Conceptual performance and dematerialized art deliberately attempt to evade commodification by prioritizing temporary human experience over permanent material things. And when the market does manage to commodify these elusive moments, artists still find ways to break the system from within. Look at the profound strategy of German artist Maria Eichhorn. In her project for Document 11 in 2002, she created an Aktiengesellschaft. In English, it means a joint stock company. She utilized the market's own ultimate tools, the legal contract and the corporate structure against itself. Eichhorn set up a legitimate public joint stock company where the corporate capital was explicitly legally withdrawn from circulation. The corporate bylaws were rewritten so that the shares could never be sold for a profit and dividends could never be paid out. So while a Swiss freeport seeks to keep an artwork hidden from tax authorities so it can act as a hyper-volatile currency, Eichhorn's work does the exact opposite. It remains fully visible within an art institution but legally dead as a financial asset. It freezes the object's financial biography, forcing the collector or a museum to act not as an owner but as a temporary, profitless custodian. Provenance research proves that art can never be reduced to a passive object of pure aesthetic appreciation. It is the literal site where historical violence, financial engineering, and political legitimacy collide. Art's ultimate value for the ruling class and its extreme vulnerability to criminal exploitation springs from the exact same source, its radically ambiguous status. It is simultaneously a physical commodity and a symbolic critique, a captured asset and a runaway object. This leaves provenance research operating within a paradox. By exposing the hidden corrupt paths of wealth and plunder, it serves as a devastating form of institutional critique. Yet, as Andrea Fraser warned, the art world has an insatiable appetite for critique. It routinely absorbs its own exposures, institutionalizes them, and turns the transparency of provenance research into a brand new badge of moral legitimacy. Ultimately, provenance doesn't just ask us to look at who owned a piece of history, it forces us to ask a far more unsettling question. In a world where everything is packaged, priced, and policed, what does it truly mean to own anything at all? And how do you read the relationship between the artwork's price tag and its ethical history? Can an object bought with dirty money or stained by historical plunder ever be viewed purely for its beauty again? Let me know down in the comments and don't forget to subscribe.